Hey everyone, welcome. It's Baron. A very exciting event has just taken place in the Path of Exile 2 community, and that is the release of Path of Building 2, a third-party accompaniment program to Path of Exile 2. Now, if you're new to the Path of Exile franchise, you might be a little confused about why a simple third-party program for looking at Path of Exile builds is generating so much excitement and even relief among experienced players. In this video, aimed at newer players or those that don't have as much prior experience with Path of Building, I'm going to walk you through what it is, how to use it, and maybe most importantly, why you should absolutely not sleep on it as one of the most powerful tools available for making you a better Path of Exile player. If you are like me and you prefer to learn hands-on and you want to follow along throughout the video, I've put the link to the Path of Building 2 installation files in the description below. It's perfectly safe. It's an open source program. You can take a look. If you would like, you can go and pause now to download that if you want to have it open throughout the video. But to start with, Path of Building 2, or POB2, is effectively the same program as the original Path of Building, or POB. It just handles Path of Exile 2 builds naturally, instead of Path of Exile 1 builds. As you can see, as I click back and forth between the two programs, the layout is basically identical. They've gone to great lengths to make it basically the same, to make it more comfortable for players who've played Path of Exile 1 and used this program before. The layout is almost identical, and they serve effectively the same function for their respective games. Not effectively, they do serve the same function for their respective games. That function is nothing more or less than creating a perfect numerical blueprint of a Path of Exile build that accounts for nearly every possible factor and stat that could influence your character's damage, defenses, any other stat that you might imagine wanting to keep track of. It accounts for your skill and support gems. It accounts for the level and quality of those gems. It accounts for your equipped gear, your passive tree, the stats of any jewels on your tree, your charms, anything that you can think of about your build. It also has the ability, if you choose, to account for individual monster attributes. So if you, for example, want to know whether your build can survive a specific hit from a specific pinnacle boss, and you even want to know, can I survive a critical hit from that boss? You can put all that information in, and you can see whether, on average, you're going to survive that hit or not, and if not, you will be able to identify which defensive layers you're lacking that would have allowed you to do so. This information is just so crucially powerful that I'm actually willing to make a rare guarantee. I'm not sure of much of anything, but I'm sure of this. Even without any further balance changes to the game, to Path of Exile 2, the release of this program, Path of Building 2, will absolutely lead to the discovery of at least one, and probably a lot more than one, powerful build that was not previously known about. The program just lets us see things in such a detailed and interactive way. It lets us experiment so easily that it is inevitable that we're going to find things out that we couldn't have without this tool. Now, to actually dive into the program itself, when we first load in, we see that we are on the skill tree page. You can see that I have the ability to click around. If I click on a skill node, and in fact, let me turn off this show node power. It's a little distracting. So this is what the skill tree actually looks like in game, and I can just click around, and the program here will automatically path to the one that I click on through the most efficient route possible. So if I wanted to go really far away, I wanted to come like down here, you can see it takes the path of least resistance. You can manually alter this, of course. You can choose which route, you can say, oh, I wanted to come down here instead, and then through here. But in any case, not really the point. We can see we are on the skill tree as a start. We can also see that there is some information along the left and along the top here that is pretty crucial for the build. And if we click between the different tabs, this information stays with us along the top and along the side. So along the top, we can see this is where we select our base class: mercenary, monk, ranger, sorceress. There's going to be a bunch of these eventually, and then our ascendancy as well. So each base class is going to ultimately have 3 ascendancies. Right now there are only 2 for the available classes. It also lets us dictate our character level. And this is important because every level that you gain in the game comes with a certain number of baseline stats that get increased as you go. And so those are going to be important if you want Path of Building to construct an absolutely perfect representation of your build, or whoever's build you're looking at. It needs to know what level you're at. Up along the top here, we also see the number of skill points that you've assigned up here. I've been clicking around, so it says that I've assigned 119. It'll even let you go above the maximum of 123 if I keep clicking, which is handy because you might want to assign more and then, okay, let's subtract some to get back down under 123. It's just convenient, trust me. It also shows us if we are using our weapon swap points here. It tells us how many of those we're using, 24 and 24. And it also tells us out of 8, how many ascendancy points are we using. So if I select Deadeye and I select a few ascendancy points over here, you can see that number goes up. Along the left here is more of just like a core summary of the most crucial numbers in the build. Your DPS, your basic defenses, your resistances, your attributes, things like that. Just really the high level stuff. There is more detailed analysis, of course, that we're going to get to when we go to the calculations page, Calcs. But for now, this is the information that is so important that it follows you around from page to page, the basic info. Now, as you might imagine, a program like this has a few different potential case uses. Perhaps you see a popular streamer running a build that you don't recognize, or you just don't know how or why the build works. That streamer can simply provide his Path of Building export code to you, and you can paste that into your own Path of Building program and see a perfect replica of his build. Every number on every item, every node on the tree. This is really valuable in a game as complex and detailed as Path of Exile, where that information might take pages of text or hours of video to convey as completely as Path of Building can do with just the code. But the raw information about the build, as great as it is to have, is just the beginning. It's just a baseline. The real power of the program comes from the fact that it takes all of these different sources and calculates them together to tell you things like how many physical hits can you take before you die, how many attacks per second do you do, how much of an enemy's elemental resistance do you penetrate, where is your spirit coming from. In short, everything that you might need to know to understand exactly where a build's power is coming from. And that actually brings me to another common and powerful case use of the program, looking at it to answer questions about and improve your own build. Now, at the moment, Grinding Gear Games has not yet implemented the ability for Path of Building 2 to import information directly from your account and your characters. You do currently have to enter the information manually. However, we can be confident that the function to automatically import your whole character will be coming eventually, because it is a core feature of how Path of Building interacts with Path of Exile in the first game. And I'm sure you can imagine how and why it would be so useful to be able to import and examine your own build quickly. You could use this in a situation like you keep getting one-shot by a particular type of mob or a particular boss. You want to see exactly what your defenses are. Between all the defensive layers like block, resist, damage, shifting, evasion, etc., Path of Building will tell you exactly where your defenses are coming from and how you can shore them up. And most importantly, I think, Path of Building also has powerful functions allowing you to search for unique or rare items that would have particularly beneficial effects if equipped. We're going to talk about this in much more depth when we get to the section on how to use Path of Building, but suffice it to say that the ability to quickly identify upgrades is very powerful. Moving on though, using Path of Building to assess your own builds doesn't even have to be builds that you currently have. It could be builds that you are planning out just to figure out how it'll work and whether it will work. Honestly, it would be hard to say just how much time and effort have been saved over the years by Path of Building's ability to tell you if a build will work from just a quick SketchUp. So many hours of wasted effort have been saved by just being able to plug in a few items and numbers and see whether it pans out or not. Now, in response to that, you may say, well, where's the fun in that? I want to level the build and see for myself. And to an extent, I understand that. And there still is a place for that in feeling out once you're actually playing the build, whether it's for you. But let me also make some counterpoints. First of all, The number of possible builds in Path of Exile is so enormous that if you're the type of person who enjoys theory crafting builds the way I am, there will likely be dozens or maybe even hundreds of combinations that occur to you that you might want to test out. And, even if you're playing 12 hours a day, it would be daunting, not to mention tedious, for dozens or hundreds of builds to have to level a new character for every class whenever you want to try out a new class, or having to save up dozens or hundreds of divines that it would take to put an endgame version of a build together, when instead you could just sketch it out in Path of Building and find out whether it just would never have the damage or defenses you would need to compete in the endgame. Doing it manually, leveling the character yourself once or twice just for the challenge and the experience of it, that might be fun a couple times. But if you want to theory craft 20 plus different builds, that's going to get pretty old pretty fast. Path of Building is the way to do it if you want to just check in quickly. There's also the fact that in Path of Exile, the cost of failure is simply higher and more severe than it would be in many other games. In many other games in the ARPG genre, if you level a build that looks theoretically good and then it doesn't pan out the way you wanted, it still probably works okay. It's probably still a passable build, perhaps a competent build. You could use it to farm upgrades or farm for another build. It's just not elite, right, if it doesn't pan out. But in Path of Exile, it is absolutely possible and even probable, I would say, that if you construct a non-functioning build without measuring it, researching it first, it could be like truly non-functioning, as in can't clear any maps at any tier. Because again, to harp on about the complexity, for every one functioning good build in Path of Exile, there's a million ways to make one that just doesn't work at all. And this, by the way, includes builds that you spend 300 divine orbs on. Currency only translates into power if you know what you're doing and you know where to put the currency and what gear to get. Throwing currency at a build will not automatically make it good, so Path of Building can save you a lot of that currency by just telling you in advance if your idea even has a shot at success. In my own experience, I imagine, I'm guessing here, I probably only actually level up in-game one build for every 10 or 20 that I create from scratch in Path of Building, and then one for every 40 or 50 POBs that I load up from other players just to check them out and learn something new. In fact, I consider that one of the best ways to learn about the game, loading up a lot of POB files for builds that you have no intention of ever actually playing, or maybe just a very limited interest to see if it strikes your fancy, but just loading them up to understand them for the pleasure of learning about them, finding patterns between different implementations of the same build, or even patterns between different builds across many builds. And these sorts of things, doing this just helps you identify and understand powerful interactions that many builds are able to use, and this helps you kind of slowly build up your mental toolbox for making your own builds or tweaking builds you've seen to meet your own, say, play style or economic situation. In other words, if you ever need to alter a build to make it more or less expensive while retaining its core identity, having this kind of bank of experience of having looked at a lot of other builds kind of gives you the instincts to be able to do that. And on a related note, the last major case use that I can think of for Path of Building is when you've looked at your build as closely as you can, you've looked at it over and over, and you still can't figure out why you're dying or what to upgrade next. You can just export your Path of Building and link it to different places, wherever you get your Path of Exile information. If you belong to a Path of Exile Discord group server, the subreddit, the Path of Exile 2 subreddit, sending it to streamers or content creators who publicly say, hey, let me workshop your build, that sort of thing. And just being able to export your build will allow another person with a new set of eyes to see every facet of your build and help you out without having to ask you a bunch of follow-up questions. Everything they need to help you is right in that code. So that's why you might want to use Path of Building too. But now let's talk about how you would do it. For starters, an important thing to know is that the information about your build is broken up across these screens or tabs, which you can see at the upper left of the Path of Building screen. Your passive tree, your gear, your gems, and some generic configuration settings that let you simulate what a normal combat situation would look like for your build. There is also a party tab here to simulate auras and other effects from your party members, though this is not used terribly often. But in addition to these tabs, there is the King Daddy tab where it all comes together. The calculation or Calcs tab that synthesizes all that information from everywhere else and tells you some very useful information about your build, like your damage per second, DPS, your effective hit pool, recovery, things that are good stand-ins for estimating your survivability, in other words. There is also here a Notes tab. This doesn't have any official function or figure into any calculations, but it is a handy place for creators of build guides to put instructions and details that don't fit neatly anywhere else in Path of Building. I myself make liberal use of this when I publish build guides to instruct people about when to take certain gems and upgrades. Then, of course, there is also a separate tab here responsible for importing and exporting builds. It is the most basic function, but it's important because unless you're creating something from scratch and have no intention of sharing it at all, for all other uses of the program, it all is going to start and end on this page. It can even be convenient, even if you're not going to copy somebody's build, to just load up somebody's Path of Building where their build is kind of like vaguely similar to what you want to end up with, just to start with the skeleton of another build. It's just sometimes it's easier to modify something that you've already got to start on rather than clicking and starting everything from scratch. Just change out the individual things that you need to change. If you're going to be constructing something even vaguely similar, you just don't have to recreate the wheel, that's all. But with that, let's go through each tab one by one, and we can start right here where we already are on the import-export page. Right now, realistically, this is just an export page until GGG releases that API, that function that'll allow Path of Building developers to activate the import from character file screen, or from your character account. Once that is active, that's going to be a major use of this page. Just being able to grab details directly from your account is a huge convenience. But in lieu of that, I've just got a random build loaded up here. It's not one of mine. It's something I kind of loaded up from a random post on Reddit, and then I clicked around and did a bunch of things. It doesn't really matter because we're not going to be looking at any specific skill or calculations. It's just to have a not blank file for us to play around with. I'll put the link to this in the description of the video if you want to load up using this import page. You can import it right here, import a build, enter the code, import. And then eventually when you go to export a build, let's see what that looks like if you ever need to do that. You would come here and hit the generate button. Now this code right here is the actual full Path of Building code, and it is enormous. And it's huge, it's pages long, and copying this is very large. But you can actually change the setting. Actually, in fact, yeah, huge code. Change the setting to POBIN. These are just the different sites that can host code. And what's useful about this is it will drastically shorten the code. So instead of having this pages long, exact, precise alphanumeric code that indicates everything about your build, that alphanumeric code just kind of gets hosted temporarily on a website, and you can just hand out the link to that website. So I've selected POBIN, POBBIN, and say share. And so it just takes a second, generates a link, and then from then on, I can just share this link, and Path of Building will recognize this. I can just give you that link, pop it in there, and Path of Building will go to that site that POBB.in has created, and it will read the code from there. This is just way easier to share with people rather than having pages and pages and pages. The important thing to note, though, before you do this, before you do any of this, is you do need to come up here and save your build. This saves the build locally, like to your machine or to a network drive if you have OneDrive or Dropbox or whatever. But you do need to save it locally because when you go to export a build, it is only going to save, it's only going to export the most recently saved version of the build. So if you've never saved the build before and you go to export it, the person is just going to receive a blank POB, just with nothing selected, no gear added, nothing like that. So be sure to save, then export, then you're good to go. Now, if you are trying to represent your own build in Path of Building, and you don't want to wait for the function to automatically import it, but you also don't really want to have to manually recreate every single item from scratch using this craft item button to painstakingly select all the mods. You don't necessarily have to do that. You can actually go in-game into Path of Exile 2, Hover over an item that's equipped on your character and hit Control-C on your keyboard to copy the item to your clipboard, and then come over here and press Control-V, and it will automatically paste that item into Path of Building. It's not perfect. It is going to take you a couple minutes, but it's better than nothing, and it's better than having to recreate it from scratch. I'm just looking forward to when GGG does implement that automatic import function, but this is okay in lieu of that. But let's actually turn our attention to this items page now that we're talking about it, and let's describe this page in more detail. As you can see, every item slot that you are able to equip something on your character is represented here. And if there's more than one item that you've added to this overall list for your build, if there's more than one item at a slot available, you can click this drop down and select between different ones. And that is just handy for being able to see, flip back and forth between gear pieces at the same slot and see which is better. You can, as I just mentioned, you can create any hypothetical item from scratch, whether, just at any possible slot. You can come here and you can select the particular base type, and then you just select the prefixes and suffixes, so pretty handy there. But more importantly, and something that deserves to go more in depth on, as advertised earlier, it is time to talk about this page's function of helping you find upgrades for your build. There are two ways you can go about doing that. On the one hand, you can look at all the unique items down here. These are all the unique items in the game at the bottom right here. Or if you want to see the best items for your build currently available on trade, and this includes both rare and unique items, you can come up to the top left here and say trade for these items. Now, regardless of which you use, the unique or the trade for these items, you can choose how you want to identify the best items for your build. What criteria, what measure do you, like when you say best how, right? Does it give you the most damage? Does it give you the most speed, the most mana? What is it? You get to define that. So when I've opened up this trade button here, I can go to adjust search weights. And this is just telling it what weighting, aka how much importance do I want to place on a particular thing. So if I'm searching for a weapon, obviously full DPS, that seems like a pretty important thing to have a high weighting on. But I come down here and I see that it's also giving some weighting to effective hit pool by default. Well, it's my weapon. I don't really care whether my weapon gives me any energy shield, life, armor, anything like that. In fact, I would go so far as to say if it does do those things, it's probably giving up some damage to do it. So I really don't want this. I can click on effective hit pool and see how the slide bar up here at the top changed to 0.5. I'm just going to go ahead and bring that all the way down to 0. I do not want it to take into account at all the effective hit pool. But let's see, maybe I do want it to account for freeze chance. Maybe that's really important to me. So maybe I come here and I at least give it like a 0.4 or 0.5, somewhere in there. Not as much of a weighting as damage. I want it to care more about damage, but if there's a way to get a decent item that has some freeze chance on it, this will kind of bump those freeze chance items up the list a little bit. So let's actually go ahead and do this. So I'm going to save this and I'm going to say find best weapon based on that. And do I want to put a price limit on it as well? Well, maybe I'm poor right now. I don't have any divine orbs. I've only got like 80 exalted orbs. I haven't been able to trade them in for divine. So I say max price 80. Now, previously, before the change was made to not allow you to replace runes and soul cores, this would be an important one here. You might want to ignore these, but for now, let's just go ahead and execute the query as is, and thinks about it, and it generates us a trade link. Now it says, if I hover over here, look, you can read, it says control click to open in a web browser. I'm going to do that. Now, what you're going to see, actually what you're going to see at the moment is nothing. So let's try to click that link again. I think it sort of forgot what it was doing there. Here we go. Perfect. Now, what you're going to see at first is a random mishmash of crappy items. Look at this, a 1 exalt item with terrible damage. Why is this coming up first when I did all that nice work to identify a good weapon? Well, the reason for this is because Path of Building put together what's called a weighted sum search. And you can see that weighted sum up here. It automatically put this together for me. It took all of the mods that would contribute to my full DPS for that particular build that was loaded into Path of Building at the time, and it created this kind of complex series of numbers here that weight how much those will impact that specific build, like that particular state of the build. So doing this by hand would be virtually impossible, unless you're just, a math savant of some kind. But unfortunately, this weighted sum, there's no way for Path of Building to tell the trade site to automatically sort by this weighted sum. It always, Path of Exile trade site is always going to want to sort first by the price. But luckily, sorting by weighted sum is as easy as finding the weighted sum on any one of these items. 232, 219 here, that's fine. I just click it. That's all. I click it one time and it automatically sorts descending. And would you look at that? An item for 35 Exalt. This is what's so powerful about this function. If you were just looking at trade in isolation, you might assume, oh, the 60 Exalt item is better for me than the 35 Exalt item. Why wouldn't it be? It costs more. Another 60, an 80 Exalt item, a 50 Exalt item. And yet up here at the top, 35 Exalt item happens to be, for that specific build in that specific state, the best item. So not only is this tool powerful, it can also save you some cash as well. So now another function that is not implemented quite yet, that we know is coming someday, and it's going to be very handy, is the ability to copy an item that you see on trade and paste it into Path of Building to see whether it would constitute an upgrade for your build or not, or how much of an upgrade. Like, is it worth the price that you would be paying? Now, fortunately, in the meantime, there is a workaround for this. A user posted a simple browser plugin to Reddit that I'm going to link down in the description, and I'm going to give credit to that user. Thank you very much. And it gives you a nice, simple export button on the trade side. And this is crucial to be able to kind of try it before you buy it, easily find out, just paste that item into your current build and does it constitute that upgrade or not. Unfortunately, the only two browsers that the plugin is available for are Firefox and Chrome, and Path of Building does not automatically load those up. I don't know if maybe I changed my default browser, if it would load up in Chrome. I thought mine was Chrome. It doesn't matter. Let me just show you if I do open it up in Chrome here. Now I get this nice handy green export button. So I'll search by, sort it by sum again, and I can just export this button. It copies to clipboard. I come back to Path of Building. That's actually Path of Building 1. Haha. I come back here and keep an eye over on this right side of the screen. All I'm going to do on my keyboard is hit Control V. And there it is, the item directly from trade. I add it to build, and I can come here and I can throw it on my character. Problem solved. Simple as that. Now next up, let's move to the skill gem page, and this is very straightforward. Every character has 9 skill slots by default, plus any extras that they get from items or ascendancy points, and every skill can have up to 5 support gems linked to it to alter or improve its effects in some way, though you can only use 1 copy of each support gem across your whole build, and it is quite rare and expensive to get the currency that will add that 5th support slot to any given gem. But this is the page, regardless, where you can interact with those skills and those support gems in your build. This is an important building block for calculating a skill's damage, the spirit reservation of those spirit skills, the duration of effects, that kind of thing. You can see when you go to add an additional support, if I click this right here, the program does attempt to prioritize those supports that would give you the most additional DPS, but I caution you not to take this ordering too seriously. It can be helpful, but on occasion, for one reason or another, it can glitch out a little bit. The numbers will remain the same. So if you add it, it will give you the correct numbers over on the DPS section, so that's not a problem. But sometimes it will just order this list wrong, and sometimes it's not the DPS that you care most about. Maybe you care more about a higher projectile count, or a wider area of effect, or a lower cost, or something like that. So this is where you do kind of have to think critically, or talk to some other players and see what might be best, and not just rely on what Path of Building recommends to you. But that's pretty much all you need to know about the skill gem section. We can move on to the skill tree section, where you can see I've kind of clicked around here. It's not terribly complicated, or at least it's not any more complicated than the real thing in the game. It's just a one-to-one replica of the game skill tree. But this is one of the most potent tools in the program because of just how tedious and expensive it can be in-game to respec your tree. By simulating which points you might want to add or subtract or just take in the first place, you can experiment with different decisions and notable skill points easily without needing to waste a bunch of game currency, followed by a bunch of manual testing where you click, 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 and then click back in game over and over again. You can just do it here in Path of Building much more easily and cheaply, free. And this will give you just the objective numbers right in front of you on the sheet over here before you even need to make the decision in-game. Just like how the items section has a tool that will identify the most powerful items for you, there is also a node power. So it can tell you which passive tree nodes will add the most to your build, and you can sort it by the same kinds of things. Do you mean the most DPS, the most energy shield, the most spirit? What do you mean by best? You come to node power, and it starts trying to calculate by highlighting in brighter shades of red if a node is more powerful. But better yet, what we want to do is show power report. Now, the power report is not, it doesn't support this balanced offense defense thing, so I'm not really sure why that's the default. I prefer to go just to like full DPS. And then as I try to have it sort by full DPS, this can take several minutes. So I'm just going to let this run in the background while I talk. But this blank spot down at the bottom here, this is eventually going to populate with a list in order indicating which nodes on the tree are best for my full DPS. And if I want, I can sort that by, is it best per the number of skill points that I would have to take to get there. So something that is, yeah, here we go. This is perfect. So yes, Deadly Force is good, but it takes 14 points to get there. Whereas, so here, if Power Shots, I only need 4 points to get there. So the amount of damage I get per node, per skill point that I spend, is much higher than this one, even though the damage is technically lower. So you can sort by per point, and I can see, look at how many of these are like right nearby and give me, just for a single point, the most possible damage. And again, you can, using this drop-down list, have it prioritize something else: armor, regen, leech, whatever. Just as an aside though, if I zoom back out and get rid of this node power thing because it's distracting, even though jewel sockets appear on the tree here, they are considered equipment. So if you wanted to edit which jewels are available to place on your skill tree, you do have to head back over to the items page. This also means that those recommended nodes that Path of Building might give you, they're not going to account for the potential power of pathing to a nearby jewel socket. The program does not know what kind of jewel you would want to place in it with what mods. That is, again, something that you just have to think about critically and independently as a human being. But those are the big three tabs that contribute to describing what your build is and does: items, gems, and passive tree. But this tab is where it all comes together, the calculation page, abbreviated Calcs. Naturally, this is the most complex and potentially intimidating page to look at, but that's because of the sheer amount of useful information crammed into one place. The very thing that makes it so intimidating is what makes it so powerful. We've just got to learn to read it properly. So let's take a look at this random build as an example and walk through the wide variety of things that the Path of Building calculations page can tell us. Now, in previous videos I've described this page as being a little bit like that scene in The Matrix, the first Matrix movie, where Cypher is reading the code off the Matrix and saying he doesn't see the code anymore, he just sees blonde, brunette, redhead, he's just that used to it. And that's the power of this program for a player who is experienced enough to just be able to read this page quickly. If you see a build you've never encountered before and you want to know what makes that build tick, you come here. Let's say I come across some streamer's build that is similar to mine. We're using, the same skills, same class, that kind of thing, but I load their Path of Building file up and it says the build is doing 2 million DPS. It's doing twice as much as me. I'm like, geez, I'm playing the same character, we're using a lot of the same items, we're using the same skill. What the heck is this person doing differently that they have double my damage? Well, you can answer that, but to do so, we'll have to do a little primer on how the damage calculation works in Path of Exile. Actually, this program, laying it out visually the way it does, is, I think, a great learning tool to help you understand that damage calculation. you will start by finding the DPS number here. So it appears in a couple places. You can see your skill DPS here in the skill hit damage, assuming that it is a hit-based skill. You would have to look further down if it was, it's going to be down around the middle of the page if it is a damage over time skill. It's just the two damage types get calculated so differently, they needed to have separate sections. But that damage, let's say you have both hit and damage over time based, that'll get combined into your full DPS over here in the summary page, so that's no problem. But this is where you'll find the DPS, and in order to understand it, in order to understand where this DPS is coming from, there's basically three questions that you have to answer, at least for hit-based damage, which, just to keep it simple, we'll stick with hit-based. And the three questions are this: how much damage is the average hit doing with this skill? Second, how many times is the skill hitting per second? And third, how many instances of the skill do you expect to be active or present simultaneously? In other words, will there be multiple minions or totems, each applying the skill independently? Or will there be overlapping explosions that you can expect to be hitting the enemy at the same time? And that last one, that's pretty straightforward, so you should already kind of have a good idea in advance if you expect that to be a factor. So basically, unless you are setting out to make a build that has multiple minions, totems, etc., or you know for a fact that there's going to be multiple overlapping explosions, you can kind of ignore that section. That, for the most part, you're not going to worry too much about that. Instead, we can focus more on the factors of how big is the average hit and how often are you making that hit. Now, starting with the speed, the rate at which you are hitting. Outside of some niche circumstances, usually involving dealing your primary damage with one of those cast when spells, things like cast when damage taken, cast on shock, etc. Outside of those, the number of hits per second is probably going to be the most straightforward section. It just comes down to your attack or cast speed in most circumstances. Attack speed for attacks, cast speed for spells. Your base cast speed for a spell will be listed on the spell gem itself. It is defined by the skill. And then, of course, it gets modified by any increases or reductions and any more or less modifiers. Those are two different things. We'll discuss that in a moment. And any modifiers to cast speed that you might find on your passive tree, your jewels, your gear, your ascendancy, those all get taken into effect and get multiplied onto that base cast speed that you find on the gem. Likewise, for attacks, your base attack speed will instead be based on the attack speed of whatever weapon you have equipped rather than the skill gem. But it too, that base attack speed, it will also be modified by comparable increases, reductions, more and less modifiers. And a quick note on the POE science behind those terms there. If you're unfamiliar, the damage, or in this case, the speed calculation happens in stages. You start with your base speed. That gets multiplied by any sources of percent increased. So any source of percent increased that you have from anywhere, your tree, your gear, anywhere, they all get added up together. And then you multiply by the base cast speed. So, by the way, it happens in reverse for reduced cast speed or attack speed. It counts at the same time. So how would that work exactly? Let's say you have a source of 30% increased cast speed and a source of 50% increased cast speed, but you also have a source of 20% reduced cast speed. Well, the 20% reduced, it just acts as a negative number. So you take your 30% increased, add it to 50, and you get 80% increased, but then you subtract that 20% reduced, and you wind up with 60. 30 plus 50 minus 20 equals 60. And so it is a total of a 60% increased speed at which you apply that base number, that base caster attack speed. Then after that, after you've already multiplied it by all the increase, a second step takes place and you multiply it again. After you do it, you start with the more and less modifiers, and they work the same way. You add up all the more, you subtract any sources of less that you might have, and then you multiply that figure again. And so the fact that more is multiplicative with increase, you don't just add them all together. The fact that it is multiplicative is why it is so powerful to get sources of both. You get a bunch of increased, and then you multiply that again by a bunch of more. Just a quick aside on the science so that you can understand that. And it's happening all right here in the attack and cast speed window. You can see here's your sources of increased attack speed, here's your sources of more or less attack speed, and then you get your calculation. If I just click on this number 0.41, I see that what the base is. I see what I'm multiplying it by for the increased and reduced, and I'm seeing what I'm multiplying it by for the more and less. And I get my total number of casts or attacks per second, and in this case, it actually is being modified again by the fact that the skill has a cooldown. That is a whole separate can of worms. Obviously, the cooldown, if it comes into play, will obviously override any attack or cast speed concerns. In any case, it is worth noting before we move on that in Path of Exile 2, unlike Path of Exile 1, there is an important exception to all of these rules we've been talking about for calculating attack and cast speed. Several skills have been introduced to the game that bypass the usual calculation, and they add a flat, non-modifiable 1 second, or I think there might be some other flat values, but the one I'm thinking of is 1 second onto the attack or cast time, and you cannot modify that, you cannot reduce it in any way. So first, you calculate all the reduced cast speed and all that stuff, and increase attack speed, and then you have to, at the end of it all, add another second on top of that. A little editorializing here, just my opinion. I kind of dislike that design decision. I would like to see that reversed or at least toned down. In my opinion, investment into a build should always let me improve my speed. Anyways, moving on. So in the same way that we talked about how you would calculate the speed at which you attack or cast, of course, we need to understand the average damage that we're getting. And the hit damage calculation is actually very similar to the speed calculation. We just add a couple extra steps in. So much like speed, you start with the flat damage, just like you would start with the base attack or cast speed. So attacks will get flat damage from their weapon, just like the speed calculation works, and just like speed, spells will get flat damage from the skill gem. There are some sources of added flat damage, but they are harder to come by in Path of Exile 2 than they were in Path of Exile 1. There are not many sources of added flat damage in Path of Exile 2. You can get them on, like, rings, for example. Hand of Wisdom in Action is a famous example of a unique item that adds a lot of flat damage, and it's probably going to get nerfed. The only other thing to note is that attack skills in particular, although you don't get your base flat attack damage from the skill gem, what you do get from the skill gem is a multiplier. This is the first step in the damage calculation. Spells don't have anything like this because they just get their flat damage from the gem itself. Attacks, you're technically getting the flat damage from the weapon, but there is an immediate multiplication that happens. And so I want to show you if I can see that here. Yeah, so the base damage multiplier, which you can see times 6.86, I believe that's the one. And what that's for is basically for creating some parity between faster and slower hitting skills. So the idea is that even if you're starting with the same weapon doing the same damage, you get a higher multiplier if you're working with like a clunkier or slower skill. It kind of puts them on a little bit more of an even playing field, although as we know, it doesn't always work in practice. You know, if you get swarmed and overwhelmed, you never get a chance to get off that big hit in the first place, but that's the general idea. A slower, clunkier skill will often have a bigger multiplier on that base damage. From there, though, we pick up with some steps that are very familiar from the speed step. So you get all those increases and reductions added up, and you subtract the reductions. You multiply the flat damage, and you can see that all here. Total increased and reduced. And you can see the sources here. So if I click on increased, it's got 120% increased fire damage. Where's that coming from? Well, it's coming from rings. It's coming from the belt. It's coming from jewels, things like that. And then we get our total tally of how much are we multiplying more and less, just like speed. And we're getting it, in this case, from a support gem. After that, there's another divergence from how speed is calculated. At this point, we assess critical strike chance. And that chance of critically striking is just figured into your overall damage with whatever percentage of the time you're going to get critical strikes, you're going to, on those particular hits, you're going to get extra damage based on your critical damage bonus stat. So let's see, is this build critting? It is, but not very much. You only have a 5% hit chance, and when you do crit, you get 2 times damage. Well, 2 times damage, but you're only getting it 5% of the time. That means the effective multiplier that you get from your critical strikes is only 1.05 in this particular build. Some builds scale crit to the moon. Your effective crit multiplier could be like 3 times, 4 times, because you're critting 80, 90, 100% of the time, and when you do it, your crit bonus it has a very high damage bonus. So it just depends, and this is where you would look to find that out. Right dead center of the page is where the crits are calculated. Now, after this, there is finally another source of confusingly named increased or reduced damage taken. And I say that with emphasis because despite the confusingly similar name, increased damage taken by enemies takes place far later in the damage calculation than simple increased damage. And that makes it more powerful. So it's way more complex in Path of Exile 1. In Path of Exile 2, this whole increased damage taken that happens at the end of the damage calculation, this is often just about elemental resistances, armor, or just the reduction, penetration, or breaking of those defensive layers on the monsters. So if you break an enemy's armor, if you penetrate an enemy's resistance or lower their resistance below 0, those are examples of causing the enemy to take more damage. And that is something that gets multiplied on top of everything else. So 10% increased damage, basically meaningless. Enemies take 10% increased damage, very meaningful, because that gets multiplied on top of everything else, not just added as a drop in the bucket of, you might have 500% increased damage. Adding another 10 onto that, that's nothing. But what about that final number? What if your final number is 50,000 damage, and then you just get another 10% on top of that? That's very different. In any case, I've been clicking, you can click into what the sources of these numbers are at any stage. You can click onto it and it will tell you where those numbers are coming from. It's really powerful to understand where the items are coming from. Just, whether it's passive points, your gear, or whatever, if you're comparing builds with somebody else, or if you want to know how to improve yours, this is how you can kind of see where these are coming from. Now to move on. The video is already dragging on pretty long, so I'm not going to cover defenses in nearly as much depth as I did offense, but the important thing to note is that the same basic underlying principles all apply. You can hover over or click into a variety of stats. You can click into flat life, increased life, more life. You can click into your armor, your flat armor, increased armor, and when you do that, you can see the sources. Just like we were talking about a minute ago with the offense, you can click to see the relative sources of all of these different stages in the defensive calculation as well. Now, this is obviously very powerful for understanding and improving your defenses. And down, if we scroll down into the bottom middle of the page, down here is where you can kind of see where the game applies all these things, and it attempts to estimate how many hits you can take, relatively how survivable you are. It's pretty reasonably successful at doing this. It's not perfect. There's always going to be factors of recovery and so forth, and just gameplay style. But in general, this should give you a rough idea of how survivable you are. And again, you can click into these things to see where are these numbers coming from. I encourage you to kind of play around with this in lieu of doing a full defensive breakdown in this video. Just wanted to draw your attention to this is where you would look and just click on these and to get an explanation of what's going into them. Let's see. Now, if you want specific answers about survivability to individual damage types rather than the default, which as you can see is spread out across all damage types, the program starts by assuming that the average hit is going to be a little bit of all kinds of damage. That's not true. What's actually true is that you're probably taking a bunch of different hits, each of which are of different damage types and approximately average damage. So this is, again, just an approximation, the fact that it's getting broken up between physical, lightning, cold, fire, chaos. If you want to be more precise, you can come over to the configuration tab, which is the last one we need to talk about, and you can look under enemy stats. You can talk about either you can pick a particular that's funny. So the boss skill presets. These are still the boss skill presets from Path of Exile 1. That's funny. I'm sure that this will be modified in the future to have Path of Exile 2 boss skills here. These are currently Path of Exile 1 boss skills. But what you can do in lieu of that is you can manually say, okay, I looked up on POE 2DB. I know how much damage this pinnacle boss is doing, and I'm going to put in, it's X number of thousand physical damage and no lightning damage, no resistance penetration, any of that. All of this is freely modifiable. You can choose, and then it will change what you see here over on the calculations page. But speaking of this configuration page, I just want to touch on this a little bit. This is the place where you can indicate whether you expect various situations or temporary buffs to be active, or to change elements about the hypothetical monster you're fighting, as we just talked about. Some of these checkboxes are just indicating, like down here at the lower right, you can indicate which quest reward you picked that affected your character. Some of them give like mono regen or chaos resistance or things. This is where you would input that information. Increased charm charges gain, mana recovery from flasks, usually little stuff. But some of these are for dictating the monster damage. Some things are for conditional stuff, like have you stunned or frozen an enemy recently. Those are important because some skills say like, X number of increased damage if you have frozen an enemy recently. Well, Path of Building is not going to know whether you've frozen an enemy recently, so you can check what your damage is with and without those things. You're not seeing that particular one on here, have you frozen an enemy recently, because the game has detected there is no particular stat on this build that would benefit from that. It'll only add it in. Now I could click this show all configurations button and get a zillion of these things. These are all the possible configurations for every possible skill gem that we're like, look at some of this stuff. Number of grasping vines affecting an enemy on fungal ground, has an enemy hit you with lightning damage. Like, there are so many things, and by toggling this off, it will just show you the ones that are pertinent to your build in its current state. So that's pretty handy. Now, sometimes you might want to go back and forth, checking, how is it with this toggled? How is it without this toggled? Sometimes you want to assume the situation that will happen most commonly. Like, yes, almost all the time, I will have shocked an enemy recently, even if they're a boss. So I can just leave that box checked. Sometimes you'd rather assume the worst case scenario. You can say like, let's assume that I'm not on consecrated ground. Let's assume that I'm frozen. I haven't stunned an enemy recently, that kind of thing. Because like, what if I'm facing a boss? I want to know what the worst case scenario is. So these are things that the program just can't predict for you. It requires your human judgment to think about what are the circumstances that you want to plan for. But yeah, that is it. That is about it. We've covered all of the major tabs here in Path of Building. So we've covered the basics of it, how it does its calculation, and why it's powerful, why you would want to use it. Now, I'm sure there's going to be questions about this. It's a pretty complex thing, so by all means, feel free to drop any questions you've got in the comments. I always enjoy answering those. And for now, thank you for tuning in, and take it easy.